Hey, everybody. It is Thursday, and because I am tied up proctoring tests today, I'm going to kind of do a little quick review just to give you some ideas of what you might want to be looking for the agricultural test on Friday. So here are some things that you probably want to know and or study and or remember. Probably the big one is think about von Thunen, Johannes von Thunen, and his ideas about the distance you have to go in his little rings to figure out what farmers are growing at what distance from that central marketplace. So I would look over that. It appears in the chapter as well if you need the graphics to look at that. But remember that there's the city in the middle. Yeah, very close by are the things that are perishables, or things that can be easily damaged, like eggs or vegetables or whatever. And so that's going to be close. The next thing out in his time was firewood because they had to replace firewood every day for heating and cooking and everything. You go beyond that, you end up with your grain products, your extensive grain agriculture, so your corns and your wheat and whatever. That transport's easy, even though it's heavy, but it's not damaged through transport. So it can be a little further out and it can take advantages of cheaper land. And that last ring is livestock, meat cattle, let's say, or sheep or goats or whatever else, because that can be walked in on its own. You don't have to put it in a wagon and transport. You can kind of just chase them to the city, and then they'll be slaughtered in the city, and that's how the meat gets there. One thing that I need you to kind of think about is you've got von Thunen's theory, but there's something related to von Thunen's theory that explains why the rings are where they are, and that is the bid rent theory. So you want to look over anything that has to do with bid rent, which has to do with the price of land, depending on how far away you are from the city. And so that explains that as the further you move out, the cheaper the land gets. And so if you have to do extensive agriculture and you're going to need more acreage to do whatever it is you're doing, you probably want to be further away from town. Whereas as you get closer to the town, it gets more and more expensive. And so you're going to have to grow crops that, or raise animals that are going to provide you the most value for the land that you have to have. So keep that in mind. That is probably something that you're going to want to know. Another thing is be looking at your agricultural hearths, where grains, where particular animals may have been domesticated. That's probably going to be useful information to know what kind of countries today would where these hearths would be, just so you can kind of locate where things are. So that's important. I would be looking at that. Um, I talk an awful lot about rice, and the chapter actually talks an awful lot about rice too. So I would know something about rice. What does wet rice production look like? Why do they do wet rice production? How does wet rice production get done? And so know what part of the world you're going to see a lot of wet rice. If you have a hard time thinking about that, think about what restaurants you go to and they always serve rice with it. It's probably that part of the world. So you're Southeast Asian or Chinese or something like that. Think about why or what conditions do you need to be able to grow wet rice. And is just as a, be careful, don't assume that everything in some place like China is going to be growing rice. Rice works best in tropical conditions. And so, if you're not in tropical conditions, it may be that you're actually growing something else. For instance, in the northern part of China, they grow wheat instead of rice because that's the crop that grows. So, be careful with stuff like that. Don't make assumptions that the whole region's like that. So, be careful. Um, Other crops I would pay attention to. Why is it that certain parts of the world do market gardening and things, commercial gardening? Think about von Thunen. That might help answer that question. Why are certain vegetable or fruit production done in certain parts of the world? Part of it's going to have to do with the climate, but also think about proximity to major population centers. Von Thunen was pretty much right on that. So keep that in mind. Why do we rotate crops? This is a something that really comes in the second agricultural revolution, the idea of rotating crops over 3 fields and later 4 fields. And it has to do with preserving the fertility of the soil. That plants, especially a lot of our crops, will drain mineral composition of the soil, and over time you get less and less return for what you're trying to raise. So if you rotate the fields and let the fields rest and replenish those minerals, you'll have more crops overall. So that's the second agricultural thing. First, agriculture, and yes, you need to know your agricultural revolutions too, is when we first farm. So we move from hunter gatherers, foraging for food, to settling down into farms. This is where we start doing seed planting. We start doing the cuttings from vines and stuff like that. And we begin to domesticate animals like the dog and the cow and stuff like that. All of that takes place about 10 years ago. It doesn't really matter what part of the world you're looking at. It seems to have happened about 10,000 years ago. And you're going to want to know in those revolutions, that's the first one, we begin to settle down in agriculture. What's the long-term consequence? For that first one, civilization is what we end up with, because we have dense populations, because there's more food available. We're living longer. We're having more kids. We can support a larger population. And so eventually we have towns and stuff. That second agricultural revolution, it bumps up our population because there's more food available with improved plows and in the rotating system for farming that we come up with. Third agricultural revolution, that's the industrial revolution. So we begin to mechanize farming. We now have machines to help us farm. That's going to increase the amount of food that we're producing. But oddly enough, at the same time, the number of our farmers begin to decline, because the farms are starting to get abandoned because people are moving to the cities, because that's where all the cool jobs are, working in factories and stuff. And so weirdly, in places like the United States and Europe and elsewhere, the number of farmers goes into steep decline at the very moment that food production begins to rise, because the machines are much more efficient at it. So that is something that usually associated with that third agricultural revolution, the industrial revolution. Now, again, there's 2 more revolutions that at least some of us believe have happened. The green revolution, which is sometimes referred to as the fourth agricultural revolution, is where we come in with the chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and we have the hybridized grains and all that mess. Sometimes that's seen as its own revolution. Personally, I think it is, but you may see references to the Green Revolution, and that's talking about that modern commercial agriculture that we do, that we generally on much larger farms will have pesticides to keep the bugs down, and fertilizers to make the plants grow stronger, faster, better, and all that. Some of us believe in another agricultural revolution, the fifth, which is the GMOs and stuff. And understand that when in the world that you live in, our increase in food production or quality of food is going to be tied to that idea of genetically modifying plants and animals to make them more productive, bigger, has the traits that we want, drought resistant, possibly having 18 legs instead of 2. Who knows what sort of mad science is going on right now in all those food production companies. So that sometimes is seen as a separate thing, but it will usually be referred to as like GMO agriculture or something like that. So you'll be able to tell, even if they're not talking about that being specifically a new revolution, you'll know what it's talking about. Which leads me to another thing, which I hope you picked up in the chapter, because I didn't talk about it very much, which is agribusiness. Agribusiness is the commercial business of feeding people. And think about how you eat today. If you're going to make dinner tonight, you're probably going to go to H-E-B or Kroger's or something, and all that food is there, right? It's like a food warehouse. And the question is, how does all that come about? And if you didn't read this in the chapter, I highly recommend you do it before Friday, because there is a whole process in modern, more developed countries, food distribution systems. That a lot of the farms that are out there are actually commercial farms. They may call themselves something else, but they're actually working for some very large agribusiness, ConAgra or General Mills or Tyson Foods or whatever else. And so they're making food for that company. And then that company processes it, turns it into the food that we recognize, like breakfast cereal or, you know, who knows, wings, whatever else food that you might get at the grocery store. There's a whole transportation system. Often the same companies control the transportation system, the distribution of food, all the way down to the grocery stores that they stock the shelves of the grocery stores for whatever it is, in cans or boxes or whatever else. So that's the whole agribusiness. And it's often referred to that. And that is the modern way that you eat, is through agribusiness. Big companies, like I said, ConAgra, Consolidated Foods, they all sound very science fiction-y. I will give you the hint that Soylent Green or Soylent Corporation is not one of them. Let's see. You need to know the difference between commercial agriculture and subsistence agriculture. Subsistence it's a family farm. You're raising all sorts of stuff. You're not monocropping. You're going to have lots of different things because you don't want to eat the same thing every day. These folks are growing food mostly for themselves. If they have any extra, they'll bring it into the local marketplace and sell it off. But that's not the primary purpose of why you are raising food. It's not to make money. It's to feed yourself. Commercial farms tend to be much larger, and they are specifically growing food to distribute into the marketplace. And so they're often monocropping, that they're growing specifically corn or they're raising cattle or whatever else. These tend to be much larger farms. They may be more financially intensive, meaning that you might have to buy a big thresher or some sort of harvest machine or something. Then that may be $3 million or something like that. But labor-wise, it's usually much less intensive than subsistence agriculture because, again, a lot of it's been mechanized. You don't have to go out there and harvest 10,000 acres of corn on your own. There's a machine that does that. And so they're producing larger amounts of food, but it's usually one thing. It could be a cattle ranch, it could be a wheat farm, it could be whatever, grown for the marketplace. Know the difference. I tripped some of you up today, I suspect, on the transhumance versus pastoral nomadism. Transhumance is when you lead an animal herd. So think about goat herders or sheep herders. Cowboys often did this sort of thing, that they actually led their animal herd from place to place so they would have enough food as the seasons changed. So they might go from high altitude to low altitude because that's where the plants are growing at that time of the year. If you are looking at pastoral nomadism, you're following animal herds. So pretty good examples of this are the Mongolians and their horse herds, the caribou or reindeer pastoral nomads of the polar regions, where they're actually following the animal herds and they make their living that way. Like the Mongolians will train horses, they will breed horses, and that's how they make their living. But they don't lead the horses. They're following that horse herd across Mongolia or Central Asia. So be careful with stuff like that. You need to know the difference. Let's see. Why do you farm certain things in certain parts of the world? Which goes back to my original thing that I had you do, which was here's the agricultural regions, here's the climate regions and vegetation regions. So there's a connection between those two things, right? You have to have the right climate and the right conditions to grow or raise certain types of crops. And it could be by altitude, that the higher up in altitude you go, the colder it gets. So certain things are not going to grow because it's the wrong temperature. It could be that it's a tropical plant. It's only going to grow in the tropics. You cannot plant this in Nebraska because it's not going to grow, or if it does, it's not going to produce the fruit that you want. So everything, when you look at those agricultural zones, you have to ask yourself, why is it where it is? Why is it so far up in the latitudes, or why is it in the tropics? And it could be the connection is the climate. That's probably the primary thing to be looking at. What's the temperature like? What kind of rainfall do they get? Because if you need a lot of rainfall, you're going to need to be in a wet area for that. So think about wet rice farming. It tends to be tropical and it tends to have a lot of rainfall, like monsoon rains and stuff like that. So you have enough water to do it. Whereas if you're in, let's say, central part of the United States, it's much drier, it's flatter, and the temperatures are cooler. And so instead of growing stuff like rice, you're going to end up growing things like wheat or corn or soybeans or something like that that is a little more able to grow in cooler temperatures, for instance, with less rainfall. And again, once you start looking at, oh, it's a desert, well, probably they're not growing anything in the desert because you need water to grow crops. And if you don't have the water, who cares? It's probably not going to happen. So think about that. Think about, for instance, why do we have meat, beef, cows in certain areas where we have dairy cows in other areas? Why do we milk certain cows in certain regions and we eat the cows in different regions? Probably has something to do with the climate. So think about cows. I say you should do that anyway because cows are fascinating. Let's see, anything else that you might want to think about? Again, think about the hearths. Where did we first domesticate things like corn, pigs, horses, chickens, potatoes? All these basic foods, where did they originally come from? And then think about, did they spread from that point too? Just because they discovered wheat in the Middle East, is that the only place that it's ever going to grow now? Is that's where it was from? So think about, did some of these spread, or are they still located in the same place they've always been? So think about that. That might be a hint, shall we say. You're going to have a lot of maps. I did give you a lot of maps in this unit, so you can kind of analyze different pieces of data to try to figure out what the answer to something is. So I hope you're ready to read a lot of maps. Other things, think about the type of agriculture you would find in LDCs versus MDCs. This one you should probably able to figure it out pretty quickly. If you're an MDC, more developed country, probably you have the agricultural machinery, you have access to fertilizers and pesticides and all that fun stuff, which means you probably do a whole lot more extensive commercial agriculture, which means it's going to look more like a monocrop. You're probably producing vast amounts of whatever it is that you're making. So that's going to be something that you would see in MDCs. In LDCs, you're going to see a whole lot more subsistence agriculture, people just trying to feed their family. And so that looks a whole lot different. And this is where you're going to have shifting agriculture, for instance, because a lot of that's going to be taking place in the tropics. Tropical soil tends to be poor. And so you can't farm the same area all the time. Every couple of years, you're going to have to move. And that's when we get into that whole slash and burn agriculture. That's why, another way of saying shifting cultivation, that you're going to have to move your farm every couple of years because the soil is going to be exhausted. So think about that. LDCs, much more subsistence. You'll also see things like plantation agriculture much more in the LDCs than you will in the MDCs. Again, these are commercial crops, yes. But in plantation agriculture, you're often growing it for export. So it's stuff like tea and coffee. It could be things like the plants that chocolate comes from. It could be some other things too, not necessarily legal. A lot of your tropical areas will also be areas where a lot of our drug producing plants come from, like opium, for instance. And there's a reason why you grow it where you do, and it's because that plant can survive in that environment. So you got to think about stuff like that as well. Why are these types of crops being grown in LDCs along the tropical regions? So keep that in mind. Let's see. Think about where famines might happen, where there is plenty of food versus where there's not enough food. And you can usually figure that out by looking at calorie counts. We in the United States probably consume somewhere around 5,000 calories a day or something because we like our chocolate eclairs and our Big Macs and stuff like that, which is the reason why we tend to also be obese. And we're not alone in this. Much of Western Europe falls into the same category because we consume a lot of calories and we sit in front of computers and talk about AP tests and stuff to people who are planning on taking a test on Friday. So you might want to think about what areas might not have enough caloric intake. That there could be malnutrition, there could be famine or starvation. And so think about regions of the world where maybe the calorie intake is not very high. I would be thinking about tropical regions, specifically Africa, tend to fall into that category. So keep that in mind. Let's see. Think about globalization of agriculture. Are there pluses and minuses to that? Pluses is that we've been able to move species to different parts of the world. We can gather those foods maybe at different times of the year. When we're in winter, the southern hemisphere is in summer, so we can still have access to crops that maybe we couldn't have in the past because we were in the wrong season. That's the reason why you get roses all year round. That's the reason why you can have apples year round, is because even in some areas where apples may have come from, it's the wrong season, and yet we can ship them in from somewhere else that has the same kind of climate. So that's a big plus. We have access to more different species of plants and animals to choose from, which is great. That changes our diets, and we have a more varied diet. Downside is things can spread that way too. So think about your fire ants and your zebra mussels and everything else that goes wrong because species get imported either deliberately or inadvertently, and now they're part of your food process. They're either eating all your food or they're displacing other species, so you no longer have access to stuff like that. And I gave you some examples, like I said, with the fire ants, the Asian carp, which is a complete disaster in the Great Lakes. I think there was a section on that in the chapter, if I remember, talking about the Asian carp, zebra mussels and everything else that either, like I said, inadvertently or on purpose got introduced into a region where it doesn't belong, and oftentimes there's no predators to eat them. And so they grow exponentially in that kind of condition. So keep that in mind, the pluses and minuses of global food production. If you have any questions, you can, of course, email me, and I will email you back an answer, and I'll try to be as succinct as possible. So if you want to know something before taking the test, you can, of course, do that. This covers up pretty much the big ideas that I want you to be thinking about. So think about the relationship between agriculture, the development of agriculture, the changes in agriculture, and then how does that impact the human population? So think in terms like urbanization happens because of a change in agricultural the way we do agriculture. Think about how the Industrial Revolution impacted agriculture, and then how did that change in agriculture then impact the human society? That we start moving into the cities and stuff like that. So that's the sort of thing to be thinking of. Look for it in the chapter, look for it in the study guides. I put up the Kahoot so you guys can Kahoot on your own. I know that when you pull it up, you get that whoops screen. If you hit the title of the Kahoot at the top of the screen, it will take you in. Now you're going to want to play against people, so play against your parents or play against your dog or whatever. But you can do that. I put I think a Quizlet in too, so you should have access to that. Anyway, you should have plenty of stuff on Thursday to take a look at and review. And this is all I'm really going to have you do on Thursday. So review up. I have opened up the summative so you can look at what questions you got right and what you got wrong, and then see if there's a pattern to what it is that you're getting wrong. Is it just a particular type of question that you're having trouble with? I will also warn you in advance, it is both multiple choice and essay. So be ready for the essay too. Think about some big idea that I might be talking about for the essay. And I am going to stop here and let you enjoy your day. See you Friday.